Right, we are live.
Now we're live. We've come a long way in the last 10 minutes.
We've come a long way. I hope it was 10 minutes. It could have been longer setting this recording up, but it's worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. It will all be worth it. So Ryan, welcome. It's good to virtually be together.
Yes.
So this is our first episode, both of your podcast and of my little
First love podcast.
Yeah. And my little side interview series project that I have yet to come up with a name for. I think it's going to be something like Healing for Our Normal, or Healing for Normal, or Breaking the Norm, or something like that. I don't know.
How about Walk the Talk with Micah Walker?
That's too much.
I like cheesy names.
Okay, then you've got it. It's nail on the head. So, I guess to give a little bit of an intro, the premise of the idea is to discuss with different people what exactly we feel is wrong with our current normal and how to kind of go about like making those maybe little individual changes as average citizens to kind of help change the normal as we're considering this quarantine period, which is kind of a big, I read something recently that described it as the great pause. And I love that. Like, it's this idea that like we have this time to just stop and really consider like what's going on around us, and also like some internal reflection, I think, is something I also appreciate about this time. But the idea being, as we're in this quarantine period, when we do eventually have to transition back to normal, what do we want to take away from this? And how are the things that we see as normal maybe not always a good thing? But for starters, I'll let you kind of give a little bit of an intro of who you are, what you care about, why we should care about you. I'm just kidding, but
we should care about everyone. That's the point.
Exactly.
Well, I'm Ryan Brown. I'm a writer. My day job is marketing, but I've written some books and things about Christianity, coming at things from a Christian standpoint, but mostly with the goal of getting back to the original spirit of Jesus's teachings and that original message. And I think, I grew up reading the Bible really diligently and in detail my whole life. And so it gave me some unique perspectives. And I also studied the history, archaeology, philosophy, theology behind and around it, and gave me a lot of great insights and some really beautiful insights as well. And some things that definitely comment on where we find ourselves as a society today. We have really intense inequality, which they definitely had back then. One of the world's richest ever human beings, Herod the Great, was during Jesus' time. You also had kings so powerful they called themselves gods and wanted to be worshipped. So that's fascinating. We're not quite there yet in our society, but we're getting there.
Yeah. I beg to differ. I think we should trying to say they're God. Get close.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating that, God started his journey with the Jewish people, with the most powerful nation that ever reigned in Egypt, and its king decided to call himself God. And then same thing with Jesus. Another extraordinary government came to power in most of the known world, and also decided that its ruler would call himself God and be worshipped. So interesting that God would choose those two times to have a big message announced. But my belief is that as you dig into the text, if you dig into the text to find God's heart, that really amazing things can happen, and that we're way closer to it than we think. Right? A lot of times we think we're just so far gone, and society's so far gone, and we've made so many mistakes, and there's no turning back, and the world's about to be destroyed, right? We're going to melt ourselves. We're all going to die, right? It's kind of hopeless.
Yeah.
And no matter how bad it's gotten, I don't think that's ever been God's message. It's like, well, too late.
Yeah.
Sorry, bye. I think that it's way healthier to start from a position of gratitude, which I think I'd love to talk about in a moment. Before I jump into that, I want to talk about something called the DISC, and you and I have had some discussions about the DISC, and it's actually what inspired this conversation and the podcast I'm doing, the podcast and messages you're doing. And the idea comes from an intellectual named Eric Weinstein. And he's a fascinating guy because he's a physicist. He's also one of the top guys at Thiel Capital, Peter Thiel. So, very smart, very in the know person.
Yeah.
Worked his way up through academia at the highest levels, and had a falling out with academia because of their corruption.
Yeah.
And we all know there's corruption, and it's everywhere where there's power, right?
Yeah.
And he coined this term, the DISC. It's the distributed idea suppression complex, or hold on, make sure.
Yeah,
right.
I think it
yes, complex. Distributed idea suppression complex, which is, it's this idea that once power structures form, they don't like to have conversations that involve them doing anything wrong.
Yeah.
Or that parts of their opinions could be wrong, right? So, and there's no like one person, saying no to all this. That's why it's distributed, right? It's every institution. And what he found as an academic is that he could not challenge things that he knew to be wrong, provably wrong, right? Because it threatened someone's job or paycheck or reputation, right? And they just wouldn't let it happen, or their ideology that protected their paycheck. Yeah. So, it's led to all kinds of really weird things in our society, right? Like, here's just one. Why is every presidential candidate over the age of 70 years old? Like, think about the people that that are like 70. Like, are they the people that you look to like start a new company or start a new project, or like they're elders and they have a ton of wisdom, but just like naturally you wouldn't choose those people to be the leader of change, right? So these are some of the weird things that happen when you live in a society that really doesn't want to change, and ideas get suppressed. Young people get forced to do things they know aren't true or know aren't right, and there's just this feeling of uncomfortability, right? We all feel a little bit uneasy and uncomfortable, and we know that everyone's lying to us, right? We know the news media is lying to us. We know that institutions are lying to us. We know that when a company makes food or product and it poisons people, we know that they're not going to admit it, right? Even if court documents prove it, we just know. And it's not great psychologically to live in that situation. Now, let's pull that back to religion, right? And how has that affected religion? Religion is another institution, and I'm not talking about text. I'm not talking about, the relationship with God side of religion. I'm just talking about as an institution, as an organization. It also follows those same patterns, right? It's better for the existing power structures to not have certain conversations. And, typically the idea, and we can discuss many of those, right? I think
Yeah.
we can have dozens of podcasts on what are those topics that, we're not supposed to talk about, right? But, and yet those often end up being at the heart of God and the heart of our modern problems.
Well, I'd like to hear even just a couple examples that come to mind for you. Like if you're thinking about this idea of idea suppression, what kinds of topics, categories of thinking are you thinking about when you're kind of talking about those things? Like give me just a couple where you're like, why aren't we talking about this? Or why isn't this thing challenged?
Well, before I go into mine, let me put it back on you, because this is one of the reasons we had this discussion, is what were you telling me was frustrating you about the silence of the religious community concerning certain very clear and obvious social, political, economic conditions?
Yeah, well, that's something I'm very passionate about. It's hard to not answer that question without creating another couple-hour conversation.
It's okay. That's good.
But for me, I think the frustration I have has almost gotten to the point of indignance. I don't even know if that's a word, but I'm becoming indignant.
It is a word.
This idea that politics and faith are totally different categories, especially as it pertains to social justice issues. I am so sick of hearing this term, the social justice gospel or the social gospel, because it's just the gospel. It is just Jesus's teachings that humanity was to be flipped on its head in terms of power structures, economical and social systems and things like that. And again, I can go into a huge rabbit hole spiral of all the things that I mean by that. But
give me one that just feels obvious to you.
Well, I have had in different settings that I've been in, I've had people tell me, as I've brought up the idea of being more involved in community, and really bringing our focus into the poor, the needy, the widowed, the orphaned, the prisoned, all of the categories of people that in Luke 4, Jesus says he's been appointed to bring the gospel to. As I've tried to, as a follower of Jesus, say, hey, Jesus said he was appointed to do X, Y, and Z. Why don't we do X, Y, and Z? It's been, whoa, hold on. Don't get distracted here. Stay in line. Remember what we're here for, to bring people into what we're doing, into this organization, into this big, in some ways, institution. And I think there are some
to make Christians, right?
Right.
That's more important than helping someone who's poor, correct? That seems to supersede in the conversation, right?
And being in that line of thinking in my life at one point, I understand where that comes from. If your theology is based on, and I've used this in conversations before, but if your theology is centered around handing out fire insurance policies to people to escape eternal condemnation, and that's the most important thing for your faith, I can understand why that feels more valuable than the here and now and taking care of people that are right in front of you and doing all the things and engaging in all the ways that Jesus engaged in. So yeah, it's hard because I see that, I see where people are coming from, and I've totally been in that line of thinking.
Well, that's a really great point, and you're kind of starting us at the crux of the whole issue, right? And let me go, let's take this back to the first century and look at the parallel, right? So in the first century, you've got this idea that, okay, first off, we got to understand that Jesus is a Jewish rabbi, right? Yeah. And he's bringing the promise of the Jews to all nations, right? So he's fulfilling the scriptures in that way.
Yeah.
And so at that time, you get a group of Jews who totally believe in Jesus and his message, but they also believe the kind of the fire insurance idea that you have.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, wait a second. If we want all nations to be saved right now, like this is the time of the Messiah and they all need to be in the kingdom, that means we need to go circumcise everybody right now.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa. And this is actually a big discussion in the New Testament, right? And you see the letters where they have to tell these guys, like, okay, we know some of you are forcing everybody to get circumcised, all the people who weren't Jewish, all the pagans and the Samaritans and the outsiders, and they're like, let's pause on that and let's really think this through and think about what God is actually saying with this new covenant. Is this about being Jewish, or is it something bigger?
Yeah.
Right. And then I think, the question that we would ask ourselves in parallel, is this about being Christian, or is this about something bigger? Is this is God's desire for everyone to be a Christian, however you define that, right? Or is it for everyone to be saved and for everyone to actually have like a nice world to live in, right? So
bring the kingdom into the present.
And I'm not saying I have the answer for that or you have the answer for that, but that's the discussion, right? In fact, that's the discussion that's going on in the first century. Peter, Paul, they're all traveling all over the world and all coming back and having these discussions with each other. And they come to some very interesting conclusions, which I think we can learn from a lot. But to me, it's part of the bigger narrative of the scriptures. And the big narrative, there's a big narrative divide in the scriptures. You're always going to have people who believe that the way to God is to follow in every way possible the law, right? So whatever God says, it starts with the 10 Commandments. And so if God says, only worship me, now you can stretch that out really far to the point where it's like, you don't even eat dinner with someone who's ever worshipped another god than you, right? Which was one of their traditions back then. Like they wouldn't eat dinner with a non-Jew, so it was considered unclean. So you can stretch these out really far, trying to adhere to this law, right? Because at that point you're assuming that it's the law, the adherence to the law that saves you. What the other side, the other argument that comes up in the text is that it's actually God's grace that saves us. So then you get in, and here's where like life comes in, right? How do you know if you're under grace? How much of the law do you need to fulfill to stay under grace, right? And this is the question that for thousands of years people are trying to figure out. They still haven't figured it out, right? Jesus has an answer, but even Jesus's answer had to be debated for hundreds and thousands, still being debated, right?
Well, and that brings up, I think, a point that I've had tons of like energy and investment and thought go into over the last couple of years in my own faith transformation, is even how important is it for us to have these answers? Like, I think for me, for a long time, the way I saw God and the priorities that the divine had for me as a part of humanity relating to the divine, the concept was that the most important thing I could be as it pertains to theology, as it pertains to my engagement with God, is right, is correct. That's the most important thing I can be. And I think what God actually calls us into, as it pertains to our connection to him as humanity, is to be love. And that ends up being very horizontal as well as vertical. Whereas when the idea is to be right and to be correct in your theology, it's all about this and getting as many other people to be connected here as possible, and you totally miss out on the horizontal, what's going on in the here and now, the way you can bring in community, the way that you can actually give, like live a life of generosity and live a life of self-sacrificial love. I think the biggest shift that I've had in my faith is that, and I actually just shared on some of my own platforms a song that I wrote, and it's the idea that God isn't angry, God is love, and God isn't condemnation, God is resurrection. And as simple and almost like, I don't want to say silly, but it almost feels childish to be coming to these like conclusions in my faith, like, oh, God isn't condemnation, he's actually resurrection, he's actually love, he's renewal, he's reconciliation. But those have been big shifts for me, because it's helped me to understand that my relationship to that divine and to the other people around me is not about being right. It's about being love if I want to live into the character and the nature of God. So I think what you're talking about like brings up some really good points, and even making me like reflect on all these other ways I've personally kind of had some major shifts in the last couple of years. And they've been beautiful shifts. Like, I think it's really hard for me to imagine like my life going back to the ways I've previously thought about things, because I've grown in like just this richness, like this deeper connection with other people, other faiths, other ways of seeing the world. And it's not all about like being the one that has everything down pat, you know?
Well, I'm glad you used the word childish, because I think that's a very important word, because Jesus actually gives us a hint and says, unless you become like a little child,
right,
you can't enter the kingdom. And, I think this is going to sound very simplified, and I think after we discuss one potential answer or strategy, that we try to apply it to the real world and show just how difficult it is, because this is not easy, right? Even thinking this way is not going to suddenly fix the world. So there's work to do, right? And in fact, what I'm going to suggest is that this is part of that work, these discussions, right? In fact, the Bible is a discussion about this.
Yeah.
It's thousands of pages of people over hundreds, thousands of years having this discussion, right, and trying to find that perfect balance between grace and praising God for that grace and being so grateful and in love with God for that grace, and following some kind of agreed to plan and law that we can all agree to and move us forward in our daily lives, right? Because, plants still have to grow, right? Electricity needs to get into the house, right? You got to make some money, right? Like, you're still a human being on this planet. So we need some kind of laws that we can agree to progress. But at the same time, where it should start, the hint that I see in the Bible of where we should start is the relationship of a parent and a child. And if you look at the relationship of a parent and a child, and my sister just had 2 kids, so I've gotten to see like the baby, toddler, young child transition and the different challenges in keeping that kid alive as a parent, right? So like when you're a kid, your first instinct is to run as fast as you can towards every dangerous object in the house. That seems to be like the design of a child, right? And so the parent is constantly like grabbing the child, like before they smash their head into the corner of the table, or, you know, and doing these things that, you know, disturb the child for a moment. But then as you're cradled back in the arms of your parent, you realize, oh, they were protecting me, right? They were trying to take care of me. Mm-hmm. They're not just telling me no. They're not just yelling at me. They're not just pulling me out of certain situations to make my life hard, right? They're doing it because I'm not aware of the bigger ramifications in the world around me, right? So this seems to be God's relationship with us. And if we can be that happy child that no matter how loud the parent yells at us, no matter how painful what they're taking away, you know, no matter how much I love that toy, when they take it away from me, I can still go back into their arms and be their child. I don't separate myself and say, you know what? I don't want to live with this person anymore. They took my toy away, and that traumatized me, and I never want that again. And so I'm just gonna live my own life, my own rules, and I don't need them. I don't need their love. You know, I'll be fine alone. And which unfortunately is the reaction of a lot of people to life, right? They're not coming at it from gratitude and from the base position that God is their parent, and everything that's happening is them growing up, right? Like, we think when we're 80 we're like really wise. To God, we're still a baby. You know, maybe we're 8 years old, maybe. But you know, one funny thing to notice is, like, people who do get to 80, a lot of times 80, 90, 100, like, by that time they're back in childhood. Like, they're just laughing, they're cracking jokes, they don't care about anything anymore. You know, they might be pooping their pants again, right? Like, it's literally like a return to childhood cycle. We never, there's not some place we get to that's bigger and better than childhood, right? And so, you know, especially in our relationship with God, I think that's the starting point. And that's how we need to treat each other. And let's compare this real quickly to the Jewish idea of God the Father, right? So this is written in the text, but the way they traditionally interpret it is as a question of inheritance, right? God is my Father. I call God my Father because I want the inheritance promised to me, right? So this is fatherhood of the law, right? And I'm going to obey the law so that I get my land and my stuff, right? Which, that is in there, right? We do get that from our parents. But if your only relationship with your parents is to one day inherit their stuff, your relationship is not going to be super deep and healing to you.
That's the big difference in terms of transactional versus transformational. Is it about the give and take, or is it about the transformative, deep grace that's involved in the love of the Father? So I love that. I love that analogy you're using.
And you have all these stories in the Bible that confirm this, right? You've got Enoch. He walked with God, and God loved it so much, he just brought him up to heaven. They're like, the guy didn't die. He just, you know, they kind of hint at it. They don't really tell you exactly what happened, but God just evacuated him and took him to a cool place, right? So and that's called grace, right? There was no there's not like a religion of Enoch that says like, here are all the things you do to get, and you do them step by step, and then God will just take you off the planet, right? You could almost view Buddhism and Hinduism and a lot of meditative traditions as in that vein, right? Because their actual goal is yet to transcend through a series of rules and steps over many, many years.
Yeah.
And that's very interesting, and it's something to, to consider. Certainly the technology of meditation is useful in breathing and, but the bigger question to me is, are you connecting with God, right? Mm-hmm. So, as we're reading the Bible, and as we're trying to be good citizens, and as we're trying to live in a country that reflects God's standards and God's heart, which I think we've done an okay job of, right? Like if you compare America as it's coming out of the revolution to England at the time, England is really, very harshly using and enslaving peoples around the world to build big houses and palaces and gold reserves in their country. Is that like surprising, or should we condemn that? I mean, that is like de facto standard human behavior, unfortunately, right? And it's not like England invented that, right? I mean, Egypt was doing that. That's how all great civilizations kind of grew, is they figured out a great way to enslave other people.
Yeah.
And
that's the concept of, we both listen to the same podcast series that discusses this idea of empire versus shalom. And that's the concept right there.
What's that podcast?
Bema.
Bema, B-E-M-A.
I don't like to say it because I don't actually know. It's like Bema or Bema. I don't know.
He said when he says the Jewish word Bema, he pronounces it like that, Bema.
Okay.
And it's the Bema was, I believe, the place in the temple where the word sat.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that idea, like shalom versus empire, what are you behind? The building of your convenience, your comfort, your power, your status, your money, the things that support you and support the big dogs, essentially? Or is it an idea that is all inclusive? I think it's in Ephesians 1 that talks about the reconciling of all things. Are we participating in the vision of God to reconcile all things? And that doesn't even just say all people, like all things, like everything, the universe being like brought back together, every heartbreak, every bit of nature we've destroyed, you know what I mean? So, and I think, keeping an eye on the time, I want to make sure we have time to kind of conclude with, maybe as we're thinking about this quarantine period, and the idea of going back to normal, from what we're talking about, these different ideas that are being maybe suppressed and not discussed in some bigger institutions and things like that, even beyond religion, what do you think we can do coming out of this time and kind of having more of an opportunity to see up close and personal some of the issues of the systems?
Yeah, good point. I feel like we could talk theologically like all day and like go through the whole Bible. Maybe we need like a 100-part series on that and just go through everything, because it's so deep, it's so beautiful, and there's so much to discuss. But like, why are we doing this? Yeah, because we want to figure out how can we as a community of people who want to talk about this stuff and want to make the world a better place, starting with our own backyards, through the principles and grace of Jesus. Where do we start in this crazy world? And I think the first starting point is actually starting the conversation. if you notice, Jesus never comes out and tells you what to do. He gives you a parable.
Yeah.
And he wants you to think hard, and he wants you to talk, and he doesn't want you to think that you have the right answer, right? He wants you to go to the text, read the word, talk with your community. And I think that's the big first step, right? Because I think the quickest trap we can fall into is thinking that we have the right answer and everyone else is wrong, and therefore they're bad and I'm good.
Yeah.
And that conversation doesn't get us anywhere. Right? And I don't think that's very good for it in here.
Yeah. It's a no outlet zone.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And then secondly, I think, coming up with just very practical solutions that have heart, right? You want to balance law and grace, right? You want to do something practical, but you also want to not just give money because it was time to give money, right? Yeah. Jesus says, if it's not in your heart to give, please don't give. Mm-hmm. Give because you actually feel something inside, and that's what you're giving, right? You're gifting that prayer, that love, that blessing to another. So I think it's important to come together as a community and start coming up with some solutions for that. Maybe you can, maybe we can do a quick sample, like what's one thing that's really on your heart right now that as a church community we should be able to address in some way, right?
Yeah. So I think an example that I've recently seen, and part of what I see as the problem with our normal is, and this kind of ties into the idea that I was talking about, that it's what's most important is to be right. Something that's really discouraged me in lieu of this pandemic, and I think there's a lot of positive things, and maybe we can hit on a couple of those to not be like super downers about all of this, but something that's kind of struck me is this idea that churches have been asked to stop meeting together publicly with large groups of people and things like that. And what has really struck me is some of the response to that being, well, this is my right. You can't take away this civil liberty. You can't tell me I can't exercise my religious freedom and things like that. Where understandable, totally. Also, isn't the heart of Jesus whatever is going to benefit the people? Like whatever is going to benefit the most vulnerable even. I'm behind that. That's the thing I'm going to stand on. And I've seen that from a lot of people, and I've been encouraged by the vastness of the people that have kind of gotten behind that and said, you know what, whatever's going to benefit the least of these, that's what I'm going to do. That's what I'm going to stand on. But there has been a bit of a response that has been resistant to the idea of taking care of other people, even if it means having to make some sacrifices. And I think we see that all the way down to, taxes, like the unwillingness to be a part of something that benefits other people for your own sacrifice, to kind of take stake in that. And so, yeah, I guess that's something that's on my heart is I hope to be somebody, a voice of love and kind of standing for, advocating for, giving a voice to people that are more vulnerable and helping other people that claim to want to live and to love, particularly into the manifestation of love, who I believe was Jesus, particularly those people that are trying to live by and imitate his teachings. I hope to be somebody that pushes us into the thinking of how can I be self-sacrificial love? If that's what Jesus stood for, if that was his overall nature, was self-sacrificial love, and you think about First John, that God is love. How can I live into that as it pertains to the community around me? And that's a big thing that I've been thinking about.
And I think there actually is an answer to that, right? A lot of times we think that self-sacrifice is like a religious thing, right? Or like it's some, like carrying your cross daily is something separate from social action, right? And in fact, what you realize as you take a closer look is that it is social action. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we have an agreement between all people that, okay, we're going to organize our society in a way where we don't let anyone fall through the cracks, right? If you're a widow, if you're an orphan, if you've got learning disabilities, if you're just poor, right? If you're a foreigner coming in from another country and you don't even speak the language, right? We're not going to let you fall through the cracks. And if we all decide that that's how we're going to live, then we can all feel good about that decision. But that decision requires a bit of self-sacrifice from every single one of us.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? Well, somebody has to go help those guys, right? So now it'd be great if everyone could take an hour a week and go serve. That would be one very effective way to get more energy into that system of helping others. Mm-hmm. We, as a culture in America, have decided to do that through the system of taxation. So I don't have to actually go do the work myself. I donate some of my money, and then we have this group of people that we organize, and we pay them to go do those functions. We have orphanages, we have prisons, we have, English classes for people who don't speak English in school. We have all these systems set up. Now,
create more institutions that have the opportunity to suppress ideas.
We institutionalized the self-sacrifice.
Yes.
Now, really nice concept. Really,
good intentions.
Not a bad idea when you're trying to do this with 300 million people. Maybe the only effective way, largely at scale. Maybe not.
Yeah.
We really haven't tried grassroots. Maybe we should, right?
Yeah.
So this whole conversation of how do you organize the energy of people to go help others? We know the danger of institutionalizing it is that I'm now incentivizing someone with money to go take care of this person, right? And I'm also giving a position of power to perhaps an individual that actually wants to use that position to abuse those people, right? To take advantage of them, to, there's child trafficking. There's all kinds of horrible things that happen in our systems. There's, people who adopt a bunch of kids and then they don't feed them and they take the money from the government, right? I don't think that's most people, but it does happen. So, let's not forget the good people though. Let's not forget our good intentions, and let's get back to those, and let's realize together we've created the most abundant, affluent society in the history of mankind. Let's be grateful for that, right? Let's be grateful that we did make institutions to try to address the basic needs of people.
Yeah.
But is it actually accomplishing what we want? And Jesus gives us the litmus test for that. Are you receiving the fruits of the Spirit, right? Is this structure producing love, hope, kindness, gratitude? Is that what's being produced by these institutions and by our connection to those institutions? Do you feel the love of God when you think about the food bank down the street? Maybe the food bank. How about the orphanage? Maybe, How about the prison system? Probably not. right?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's a big discussion, and it's a long way to go from our current feelings about society to when you think of your country, just, you know, only the fruits of the spirit, you know, coming up in your mind and body. So we have a ways to go, but I think if we start at a place of gratitude and realize, like, you know, God's arms are around us and he's our father, let's start there. Let's start every discussion there.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I think that'll be a helpful place.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing those ideas and kind of digging into this time with me, figuring out what we can do with our great pause and how we can kind of reevaluate the normal in the ways that the systems aren't working for the people we hope for it to, and how we as people seeing those issues can actually take part in maybe changing the conversation a little bit so that we can start to address those issues. Yeah, I feel like, you know, starting these conversations more and more is going to eventually, like, you can't ignore it when it's being talked about all over all the time. Like, I think the more we can get those conversations started, I think that is a huge starting point. So
100%. You're being part of the solution.
yeah, I'm excited. Well, we're stoked to have you, and thanks for letting me also be on your first episode.
Yeah. Thank you for your heart just to make a difference, right? I feel like we live in a really interesting time. Like, most young people, I think, would agree with you
Mm-hmm.
that these conversations need to be had.
Yeah.
That they're very important for the future. That if we allow our good intentions to be institutionalized, that maybe that's not good for us, right? Yes, they're doing some good things, but they can also end up suppressing discussions about how to do better.
Yeah.
And that obviously is not God's will. So, or the will of the country, right? So I think the two go hand in hand, and I'm really looking forward to more discussions. I think everyone should go start listening to Bema podcast. Marty Solomon's an amazing teacher.
Yeah.
Teaches, reads through the entire Bible, trying to stay as close to the Jewish interpretation of the language as possible, and really helps elucidate a lot of things. If you're a little more on the intellectual side, Eric Weinstein's podcasts have some good content. Not all of them are applicable, but a lot of what he says is fascinating, just about the institutional narrative and how wrong it can be.
Yeah.
And
it's a little like mind jolting a bit. It's like, whoa.
Yeah, it's really incredible.
Yeah.
And this is exciting. This is an exciting beginning.
Well, maybe we'll have both of those guys on.
I think we should.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan.
You know, his podcasts are starting to go like 2-3 hours. So we
barely scratched the surface.
That's right. We have barely scratched the surface. So it's awesome.
Well, thanks a bunch.
Thank you.
On.
Bye.